The Summilux M 50mm is kind of a classical lens. It was the first from Leica that named the lens Summilux, which actually represents lenses with aperture below 2 and above 1.0. This 50mm was the first one in the series and started in 1959 with the first optical formulation, which was replaced in 1961 by one that would last up until 2004, one designed by the famous Walter Mandler, an optical engineer from Leica that made many famous designs, and was only replaced in 2004 by the Summilux M Aspherical, which was way better in terms of optics. Even so, the original was really good. The one I'm showing you here is the Type 3, the third version with integrated telescopic hood. And actually you will have this usual construction with the aperture distally placed on the lens, like usual Leica fashion, and this very smooth focusing ring. And you also have, for those interested, the equivalent Summilux 50mm 1.4R for the old Leica reflex cameras that you can adapt. Great construction, great optical characteristics, and we're going to look at a few examples right now. So here it's in London. I'm using the Leica M240 full-size sensor body. It's a rangefinder camera in London, and yeah, this lens is very precise in its rendering. Really great in normal contrast situations, like we have here. It's quite compact. It's not the most compact 50mm lens, of course, but its aperture is great for low lights. And it's got a slight barrel distortion we can see on the right. It's quite convex, but it's not that bothering. You can always correct it in post-processing if you want. I don't. I think it's fine. And yeah, very, very nice rendering. The colors are smooth. In those next two pictures, on the left, we have a good example of the bokeh. Even at further distances, like if you look at the bottom part of the image, which is in focus, you can actually have your further planes be quite smoothly erased and smoothed out. So really nice aperture. It's a good compromise, I believe. On the right picture, street photography scene. Again, you can see this 3D rendering is at 1.4. All of those examples are going to be in 1.4. It's mostly how this lens is interesting to use. And it's got a very particular character, wide open. So that's a good indication. It gives you a good idea of what the rendering is in higher lit situations, with those really warm colors. And again, those two next pictures. Here we have a better idea of what happens when you have high contrast, which is really part of the character of this particular lens. If you look at the passerbys below, on front of the this white wall, you can see this really strong halo, and you actually have this same halo on the whole hotel because it's really strongly lit. That's really the character of this Summilux 1.4 lens, 50mm 1.4 lens. You can also see in the tree the slight circular bokeh. Not bothering at all. It's part of the character. It's not that strong, but it's there. You have to think of it. Of course, if you close the aperture, you will get something with less of a halo. You'll get something more precise up to a certain point. But and on the right picture, same thing. You can still feel this halo on the passerby on front, the bottom front, and this overall really soft but precise rendering with warm colors. The two next pictures. Here it's really contrasty situations, still in London, in Regent's Park. Interesting to see how this halo effect modifies the overall picture. The 1.4 gives it also a really strong sense of depth. As you can see, this alley just fades away both front and back. You can also see some flare on the left picture, subtle, but you still see it with some color distortion on the flare images. But yeah, and on the right you can see the cat's eye bokeh in high contrasty parts of the picture, which is the water reflections and on the droplets. But it's not too disturbing. It's actually well balanced. It's got an interesting character, and of course there's some chromatic aberration in the high contrast regions of the image with some cyan and magenta components coming out. Again, those two pictures gives a good idea of what happens when you really go into the direct sunlight with high contrast situations. You do get some flare, but it's not that disturbing. Depends, of course, of the work you want to do with the lens, but on the right picture you definitely see those ghost images coming out from this exposure towards the sun. But you can actually manage it pretty well, like on the left picture, when you have something not as contrasty, you actually don't have the flare image, and you can, with this 1.4 aperture, you can really get some of the low lights out, even with an older sensor like the M240 sensor. And yeah, of course, the depth of field makes for interesting, this 3D pop of the soft bokeh front and back is really part of this tool. Here are two pictures a little bit older. On the left, that's during the height of the pandemic in Geneva, Switzerland. And again, focusing in the sun, there's some flare, but it actually blends pretty well into the overall halo of the high contrast situation and gives it a distinctive character. And on the picture on the right, you really can see this halo effect, which is very, very characteristic of this lens on the neon lights on the top right. That was in London. It's kind of an art exhibition in one of those empty spaces, business spaces. It was used, recycled for an artistic venue. You really have this kind of double image-like effect with a very precise image, very well-defined image, and a halo-y image on top. So it's a kind of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of image. Again, on those two pictures, I'm going into lower light situations now. Even with an older sensor, which is not that sensitive, you can really take advantage of the aperture of this lens. It's not a 1.0 or 1.2 lens, but it's pretty decent for the size and for the price. And if you take, even with an older sensor like this one, you can actually have some interesting dynamic blurs and can make good things with it. And of course, this halo effect and the smoothness of the bokeh makes a lot for the character of the images coming out. Same thing on the right picture. It really excels in night renderings, and you can get rid of the halo effect by closing the aperture a little bit. Here again, a good idea on the left picture of this closed bokeh and the way it's soft, still presents those cat's eye like higher intensity zones, but soft, precise, really a very nice warm color rendering, as we can see on the right image. And going back to halo effect, those two next pictures in streets of, again, it's still the streets of London. This halo effect is really part of the character of this lens. And as you can see, it does actually respect pretty well the color of the light source. It's pretty accurate. It's not going to make some weird colorings in the halo. So yeah, the scene actually feels more like the real thing. Even so, it's not as precise as would be another kind of lens without this effect. But the reproduction of the field is actually really great. And on those two last images, I'm kind of switching to something a bit different. The picture on the left is done on a non-full frame sensor. It's a Leica CCD M8 camera. So it's basically it's not a micro four thirds, but it's close to micro four thirds ratio. So you actually get the best part of the image of the lens in the middle. Center is really best, and that's a good idea of what the rendering you would get with a smaller sensor. And on the right, there's a Leica R-mount Summilux 50mm f1.4, which is supposed to be quite the same. It's actually a little bit different. I might talk about it in another video, but just to be aware, there seems to be less of this halo effect in the rendering. Very well, not very different, but a slightly different character for sure. Same family, of course. It's kind of the same bokeh and warmth of colors, but we'll have to check more into the details in the future. But that's just to put in perspective that the Summilux 50mm f1.4 M is not exactly the same as the R version. This lens has some really very unique characteristics. As often with those Leica lenses, this design is not produced anymore, so you'll only find it secondhand. But it's really going to depend on what kind of rendering you want, and depending on the work you do, this might as well be the good tool for you. It's got a very soft but very precise. For a very long time, that was probably one of the most bright and precise lens in the 1.4 aperture category. Now we have newer designs and new technologies that make them probably more precise, but depending on your work, as we've seen, the characteristics artistically in the rendering might be the ones you're looking for. So highly recommended lens, a classic, and yeah.